안녕하십니까? 서울 G20 정상회의가 곧 시작됩니다. 세계 경제를 대표하는 선진국들의 회동이라는 점에서 큰 의미를 갖는데요. 이번 서울 G20 정상회의에서는 기존 의제 외에도 개발 이슈 등 새로운 의제도 논의될 예정입니다. 하지만 한편으로는 G20에 속하지 못한 빈곤국과 개발도상국에 대한 우려의 목소리도 나오고 있는데요. 이와 관련해서 지난주 서울 개발 토론에선 G20이 앞으로 해결해야 할 과제는 무엇인지, 빈곤국과 개발도상국에 대한 역할은 무엇인지 함께 고민하는 장을 마련했습니다. 그 현장으로 가보시죠.
Welcome to Seoul National University, Graduate School of Public Administration. I'm Huck-ju Kwon, Director of the Asian Development Institute. This year is a historic moment for Korea. In a few weeks' time, there will be a G20 meeting in Seoul, where the policymakers from developed and emerging economies coming together to discuss the global governance for the future. Considering the Korean experience in the last 6 years, from the poorest country in the world to the one of the leading industrialized countries, I think we can offer many things to discussions. But also we know that there must be a discussion for poverty reductions and social development in the developing countries. To provide that contribution, last 2 days we have a conference for strategy for social protection in the global multi-crisis. And we have this session, panel discussion. We named this is a Seoul Development Debate. And we invite distinguished scholars from abroad and Korea. In these panel discussions, our aim is that not only panelists present their views, but also we have an interactive debate between panelists and our young people and the scholars from public. So we can have different voices about these policy issues. So I will just introduce first our distinguished guest, the Professor Kim Hyun-mi from Graduate School of International Studies, Ewha Women's University. And Dr. Manuel Riesco from CENDA, Research Institute for Social Development in Chile. Professor Thandika Mkandawire, Professor of African Studies, London School of Economics. And from my left, Dr. Sarah Cook, he's Director of UN Research Institute for Social Development. And Dr. Kang Ju, she's a research fellow of the Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security. And last, not but least, Dr. Asep Suryahadi from SMERU Institute, Indonesia. So I will explain the format of discussions. We have 4 questions in these panel discussions. So I will ask first the panelists to respond these questions. Then we will get the comments and questions from the floor. After that, the panelists will react. So we will have a more live debate in this session. Our first question is that very traditional, age-old dilemmas, but it is still very important questions. So I will ask this question first to Professor Kim Hyun-mi from Ewha University. Which is first, social protection or economic development?
Thank you, Professor Kwon. This is a very challenging question, but I will try to answer, perhaps based on the experience that South Korea went through since the 1960s. First of all, the question was asked whether we should go for social protection or economic development. If I give my answer first, my answer is we need to do both. So I think it shouldn't be an either-or question, but it should be social protection and economic development. In the South Korean case of economic development, we obviously started with a much more focused effort on industrialization and economic development. But we have to remember when Korea began its economic development in the early 1960s, our GNP per capita was only $81. So one of the really poorest countries in the world. The way we started our industrialization was based on light manufacturing sectors development, which employed large numbers of people. And this was because it was really out of necessity. We didn't have any money, we didn't have any technology, so the only thing that we really had was abundance of relatively well-educated but low-cost labor. So that's how we started. At the end, when we started with this light manufacturing sector-oriented economic development, which led to exports and then later to heavy and chemical industrialization, although we didn't intend for social protection and we may not have intended for a lot of employment, we ended up employing large numbers of people at low wages. So thus our economic development compared to many of the countries went before us, including many of the Latin American cases, our inequality was relatively low. We were able to employ large numbers of people. So we were able to spread wealth and perhaps welfare later on. So I think the experience of the Korean case tells us that we need to be promoting economic development with social protection and welfare in our minds. If we don't do that, we may end up promoting economic development that has no sense of inequality within the country to protect the people who may fall vulnerable in the process of industrialization. So my answer is we need to do this together.
Okay, thank you very much. Sarah, do you have a...
Yes, thank you. I think I would just build on, I totally agree with the answer that's just been given, but maybe I'll add that I think there's a complementarity between the two. You can't develop your economy without having mechanisms that protect people in that process. And so I think this means, in fact, they're often the same sets of policies that to develop economically, that the focus is often on growth, but ultimately what we're looking for is economic development that improves the welfare of people. So if you put those together, you can see that these aren't separable. I think in terms of the lessons that we have for how this can work, there are many different institutional arrangements. I think often when we think of social protection, we start to narrow it down to a particular set of instruments. But in fact, in the processes of development, we see there are many different ways in which people are protected from the costs of economic transformation, the need to move labor out of agriculture, urbanization processes. There are always people who bear costs of these. And unless we can provide some basic level of security, it may make it very hard for people to move. And let me just give you an example from the country that I do research on most. In China, there were many what I would call social protection mechanisms in place which helped the rapid economic growth at the beginning of the 80s. One of them, as was mentioned, was a level of basic health and education. So I think investment in human capital is a critical part of economic development. And that's also a social issue. The second thing that people had, which was provided basic security, was relatively equal distribution of land. That was also similar in Korea. And those, although we may not think of those as social protection policies, they provided a social protection function. And so I think often we need to look at instruments that provide social protection that are not necessarily specific welfare programs, but that we can see they provide the role of social protection in a process of rapid economic change. So I think in those ways, we need to look at the synergy between social protection and economic development.
Okay, thank you. I just wonder how the Asep will respond to this question from Indonesian point of view.
Thank you. I suppose many developing countries, including my country, Indonesia, chose to go to the economic development first. And perhaps the reason for this is because the benefit from social protection is not so obvious compared to the benefit from economic development. But we ignore social protection at our peril. And Indonesia learned this the very hard way. Yeah. When the Asian financial crisis hit our country very hard in 1997, we were not prepared at all. We had no social protection system in place. And as a result, this crisis resulted in very severe social impact. So from this, we learned that it is important for countries to develop social protection from the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe Thandika, you respond to the question.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that by definition, if you define development as meaning well-being, sense of belonging, and sense of security, then by definition, development and protection are the same. I mean, they're interdependent. Social protection is one of the major instruments for development. In many ways, and there have been a lot of studies on for instance, on human capital, that people invest in themselves if they feel secure, or they take more risks if they feel they're protected. And the many forms of social protection, including pensions, for instance, are a major source of funding for development. So in a way, it's an instrument. It's both part of the definition of development, I think part of human existence, that we normally protect ourselves, except under very historically unusual period. I think Kalpolanyi explains this quite unusual period when there was no social protection.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I think then we invite the questions and comments to this first question from the floors. Anyone who like to raise questions and comments to the panelists? Well, there, and please give your name and give a question.
Professor. Hi, my name is Hyojin Jang, a graduate student from GSPA, Seoul National University. Since I'm the first questioner, I would like to ask basic question to the panelists. Advocates for social protection program in the process of development argue that social spending contributed to production side of one's economy. It may be true that social spending is conducive to economic production. However, in least developed countries where their budget is limited, spending money on social protection programs sounds like unrealistic and inefficient. Instead of providing social protection program, government of developing countries might need to focus more on industrialization, which will make jobs for ordinary citizens. So here my questions are: first, theoretically, hasn't the academic literature of welfare regime and social protection been exaggerating the productive capacity of welfare spending? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe we collect a couple of questions more. Anyone who like to? Okay.
Hi. Hi, my name is Greg Porombescu, and I'm a student at GSPA here at SNU. So my question is related, well, let me explain first. So we've learned from East Asian experiences that social spending can serve as a strategic tool and can be used to stimulate economic development in developing nations. Typically, this approach strategically targets key productive sectors in order to support these sectors' growth. Considering the effects this approach had on the economies of East Asian nations, it's safe to assume that social spending can stimulate economic development. On the other hand, given the widespread debates regarding the merits of social spending in developed nations and the popularity of reform packages such as new public management, the positive effects of social spending are not as evident in developed nations. Thus, can we assume that social spending has different outcomes depending upon the levels of economic development?
Okay, I think the question is about the prioritization of the social policy and social protection and limited resource. Who would like to respond to these questions? Sarah?
Okay. Well, I'll have a go with the first. So very interesting questions. I think, do we exaggerate the productive capacity of welfare spending? I think, welfare spending, social spending involves a whole range of very different kinds of expenditures and policies and programs. And I think what we need to think about in each context. So, for example, in lower income contexts, I think the arguments we've already heard that investments in basic health education, apart from an argument that intrinsically this is essential to human well-being and dignity and that there are rights-based arguments for them, they clearly are a basis for industrialization as you're developing, for people moving into productive employment. But they cannot serve that purpose alone. So you're absolutely right that countries need policy space to develop appropriate labor market policies, industrial policies, trade policies that support their own domestic sectors, whether that's agriculture or industry. So I think it can't be seen separate. And I think the more that we can link economic and social policies and see them as intrinsically interrelated, the better. The other point I'd like to make is that many economic things we might say are economic policies can potentially have very important redistributive and welfare functions. I mentioned, I think, equitable land distribution. Another thing that happened with the Chinese reforms was that they had a controlled price system. So you had quotas in the 80s. Farmers had to provide a certain amount of grain they produced to the state at a fixed price. Now, what that did was provide them a guaranteed income. Above that, they could sell to the market. So what you had was essentially a protection system.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to have some more questions before I go back to panelists. Anyone? Okay. Yen.
Thank you. My name is Yen. I'm a PhD student at GSPA. Coming from a developing country, my leaders always tell us that, well, it's not a problem to provide basic social protection, like basic health and education. That's important for economic development. But then they are very reluctant to go beyond that, simply because of that will increase the cost of production, will make the economy less competitive, especially a country like Malaysia, which rely very much on FDIs and the export-oriented economy for growth. So my question is, how should we interpret this triangular relationship between economic growth, social protection, and democracy? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I have one more question. Anyone who?
Hi, my name is Yoonji Kim, and I'm a graduate student at the GSPA of SNU. And I know the panel has already mentioned that we don't have to choose between social policy and economic development. We can pursue a more comprehensive policy. But my question is, so in academia we know this, we've heard from numerous examples and research, but how do we convince the policy decision makers that it's ideal to pursue these comprehensive policies? Specifically, politicians are under this very hard time pressure to produce short-term results. And citizens often lack this long-term perspective. We want to see results now. And lastly, how do we convince people of the upper socioeconomic class that this is actually ideal for all of our welfare? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the panelists agree that we should go together with the social protection and economic development, but the floor's question from students is really how to do it. That's, I think, really important question. Maybe Professor Kim, do you like to respond?
Sure, I'll go back to the issue about, I think in some ways we really need to see how we can combine social welfare or social policies within the policies and programs of economic development. Using South Korea or Taiwan as an example, what we have seen is these development programs or policies were much more inclusive. And at the end, in comparison to other cases of development, I mentioned earlier Latin American development that was much more focused on import substitution, industrialization, employs small numbers of people, but in high-paying jobs and so on. And we, as the public, must tell our governments, push our governments to have these more inclusive policies. And I think that's the spirit of concepts like human development, rights-based development, and so on.
Okay, thank you very much. Thandika, do you like to intervene?
Yeah, sure. Look, there are a lot of things in social policy which are expensive. I mean, knowledge is expensive, but if you think knowledge is expensive, try ignorance. It's much, much more expensive. And the point I'm trying to make here is that, you know, it might appear at one time that feeding labor properly is expensive. But I don't know of any capitalist who wants to go to a country where there's massive starvation. That is, the fact of the matter is that there are many times when capitalists themselves would wish somebody would provide healthy labor. They don't want to pay it for themselves, but they would wish somebody else in a collective action, somebody else did it. The myth that you have to have a suffering labor in order to attract investment, I think one must fight against that. And finally, we have to remember that development involves something I would call social efficiency. People are very preoccupied with the sort of micro-level efficiency, that how much will it cost a firm to provide pension, to provide higher wages. But we forget that actually development is not simply the efficiency of individual firm, but is also the social efficiency, how society, and by that I mean, can society as a whole transform resources more productively? Is it more peaceful? Is there less conflict?
Thank you very much. I think we are too ambitious to have discussions and 3 other questions to two hours time, but I think we should move on to the next 2 questions. But before to the next question, I should have mentioned that those who support this conference. The first, the Korea International Development Agency and Seoul National University Brain Korea program, they really generous to support this conference. I take this opportunity to thank their generous support. So let's move to second questions. You know that the Korea is now OECD Development Assistance Committee, and we are now very proud as a new emerging donor. But the question is that official development assistance, is it for national interest? So I will put this question to Dr. Kang.
Thank you for having me, Professor Kwon. What I'm going to say doesn't represent the opinion of view of the government, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. This is purely my personal opinion. Official development assistance and national interest, it is a controversial topic. But in my opinion, there is no reason to think that official development assistance should forego national interest. In reality, even ODA, given only with the recipient interest in mind, such as promoting human rights and peace, benefits donor countries indirectly in the long run. The concept of a national interest is broad, but tends to be narrowly interpreted for criticism's sake in the field of ODA. So as scholars and practitioners of official development assistance, a more constructive question to ask regarding the relationship between ODA and national interest is not whether ODA is for national interest, but what national interest is appropriate to be pursued with ODA. And one mode of official development assistance is likely to serve both the purpose of official development assistance and national interest. That is from me. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Asep, how do you think about that? How is your opinion about these questions?
I think it's not automatically for the national interest. It depends on how you do it, basically. If ODA is used to support, say, a totalitarian regime in one country, you are basically putting a time bomb. When this regime was toppled down, you become the enemy of the people of that country. But if you use your ODA to develop people-to-people relationship with the Korean people, you building partnership, you building friendship with the people in other countries, and that's for the rest of your life, for the benefit of both countries. So I think it is very important to think when you do it. It's not just a mechanistic thing, giving assistance to a country, but you should think how you do it effectively, how you work together with the people in the country, not only with the government of the day. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thandika, do you like to?
Yeah, I assume I have no problem with aid being for national interest. That is, if a government, if people. My reading of the literature on Europe is that citizens actually don't mind aid being done for solidarity reasons. That is one of the strongest cases in all the polls that take in Europe about why people support aid. Sometimes politicians think that if they say it's going to create jobs or it's fighting terrorism or it's going to fight communism, they think that buys votes. But actually, most of the studies show that citizens are very happy to be seen to be doing something out of solidarity. And so one should not underestimate the human desire to help other people. Now, that may not correspond to the national interest in terms of as understood by politicians. I mean, politicians, they may define a national interest separately. Unfortunately, there is no relationship between intentions and effectiveness. You can have very good intentions and have totally wretched policies. I mean, but I would personally wouldn't be surprised that if, even in Korea, if citizens felt that, solidarity mattered, I think the idea that to persuade them that they're doing it because they're going to get more exports, usually it's not true anyway. So it's probably better to work on this on a very solid and perhaps more reliable basis politically for aid than the selfish motive for aid.
Okay. Yeah, I think not only is this G20 meeting in a week's time, but there will be another very big, important global meeting next year in Seoul. That is a high-level forum for aid effectiveness. I think in that context, this question we should think about more. Well, before I go through the all panel members, maybe I invite some more questions and from the floor. Okay, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Lisette Serna. I'm from Ewha Women's University. I appreciate very much the opportunity of learning from your knowledge that you share with us today. My question is related to the motive of giving ODA and how the growing consensus that ODA should be given only with more humanitarian purposes. And I'm still trying to understand the complexity and overlapping of both concepts and if it's even possible to separate them. So I would like if you can give us an example, in your own opinion, of what will be an ODA allocation in the two opposite scenarios. Is it only for humanitarian motives and only for national interests? Thank you.
Okay. Maybe one more questions.
Hello, I'm So Min-shin from Ewha Graduate School of International Studies. I really appreciate this opportunity to share our thoughts and ideas. Traditional donors generally provide their ODA based on their experience. Some have started their assistance with war reparation program, and some provide their aid based on past colonial experience. So based on its own experience, what could be the motives and future strategies for emerging donors, and how could emerging donors be able to build its unique and effective aid system? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the Korean case, we are becoming a donor, but we never have experience as colonizers. I think so. That is very unique experience. So we need to think what kind of the future plan for our ODA policy. I'd like to invite Professor Kim and me to respond to that questions.
One is that although Korea brings its own set of development experiences that are very relevant for low-income countries, but it really must try to provide its example in the context of learned global norms regarding donor behavior. And one of them is to not pursue too directly a donor nation's national interest, which is translated into having very tied aid, which means that even when you provide ODA, you put a little tag saying only our donor countries' companies can participate in projects. That's tied aid, and what we have learned from traditional donors is that usually is only or more beneficial to the donor countries' companies rather than the intended people in the partner countries that really need the support. So that's one lesson that I think Korea needs to keep in mind when we're trying to develop our new sort of method of ODA. Second, when we say that what are some of the useful lessons that we learn from the traditional donors is we must try to provide aid in a more humanitarian way and not be so based on our national interests, like looking for natural resources or only looking for ways that could benefit the donor country. So we really need to be mindful of what is the ownership, what are the people and the government saying from the recipient country. So we should be more respectful of their interest and their strategy for development rather than just promoting the donors' ideas and programs.
Thank you. Well, I like to have more questions from the floor.
Just one follow-up.
Okay, do you like to? Yes.
I think it was important, last point you made. One of the things about aid is institutional and national amnesia. If you read European literature or their Marshall Plan, there's a whole series of complaints by Europeans about what Americans did to them. And yesterday I was just talking to somebody here in Korea, and he gave me a list of the fights that Korea had with the US. And each donor forgets that, and they seem to work on a model that do unto others what others did to you. You know, that instead of saying, look, and I hope that Korea will not accept that moral, that motto of saying we will do to you what Americans try to do to us, and learn that aid works better when you have an autonomy by the recipient.
Okay. Any other further questions from floor?
Thank you. I'm Suyeon Jang from Ewha Women's University. I really agree with the Professor Mkandawire that the intention and effectiveness is not related to each other. But in order to enhance the aid effectiveness, it is very important to enhance the public awareness. So because all sources of ODA come from the pocket of taxpayers in donor countries, thus in the long-term perspective, it is essential to enhance public awareness on the reason why we should provide aid for humanitarian purpose or for national interest. So my question is that how could the government and policymakers raise public awareness of ODA to make more focused and effective support with humanitarian purpose or national interests? Thank you.
But I will have more questions.
My name is Huck-ju Kwon, and I'm from Huck-ju University of Foreign Studies. And I wish to thank the speakers very much for being so informative and provocative. And generally speaking, G20 forum that will take place in Seoul on November 11th is likely focusing its agenda on current world economic imbalance, because those are the major impact on global economy, so that the issue of ODA could be pushed back from this priority list, even though we are fully aware of this effectiveness and impact. So it is highly likely that priority policy would be placed on attaining currency stability rather than solving the problem of development assistance. Thus, what is really needed at this point is to bring the problem of ODA to the priority list and specify it as an urgent issue as well as economic problems. So my question would be that to achieve this, I want to ask the panelists, what we should do and what we are supposed to do to solve this chronic problem.
The Korean government inserted the development agenda as a way of keeping the momentum for the G20. So it was very wise, and it was very wise move, and then it was very universal approach toward G20. But and as are all the global economy issues like currency issues, trade, and climate change, you name it. All those issues, development issue is not an easy problem to be solved by at one summit like that. So just making the development development is a global issue. And then there are developing countries who are victimized by the financial crisis. Making awareness of that issue is enough sometimes. And then especially that issue was raised by the former developing country like Korea. It is very valuable. And then I think there will, even though we may not solve the entire problem of development at this time, but we can keep the momentum for the development and keep the momentum for the G20, so that the development issue will not forgotten in the next years. Okay.
Yeah, I think the ODA effectiveness is important, but also we need to think that sometimes ODA hurts. It's not always help. Yes. Sometimes it hurts in the developing countries. So we should be very careful to not only achieve the aim of that policy program, but not to make a kind of a hurt to the livelihood of the recipient countries. Any other further questions to these ODA issues? Do you like to respond? Yes.
Yeah. A general idea, in addition to what my colleagues have said, is the following. I think that we face, especially you that are young, you face quite a challenge in the decades to come. And it's the challenge that half of the world that still are in a state of backwardness, or they are still peasants, as both our countries, for example, were 50 years ago, well, they are going to become developed. ODA is really a good thing that could help in this manner. Now, the basic thing is what we do with ODA. And I think there is one point where we cannot commit mistakes. If we help to build strong and democratic states in the countries that are developing, I think it is for sure that we will help.
Yeah, I think it's, when you do ODA, there is a temptation to things have a very quick result, but that can undermine the recipient country's administrative capacity. I think that is a part of we need to think. Maybe I'd like to invite Professor Jimmy Adesina from South Africa to comment on this question. Do you like to have any comment?
No, I think the clear lesson in the African context, and you can see clearly, for instance, in the first 2 decades of post-independence and then the 2 decades after that, is that ODA works when they complement national initiatives. The first 2 decades, you had countries develop their own national plans, have a clear idea about what they want to do. And development assistance is precisely that, to assist those countries in what they've decided that they want to do. Over the last 25 years, ODA in many cases have been of a reverse type. It has been displacing countries and displacing what countries want to do. So you may have a situation where a country is already doing something, but another country decides that we're interested in supporting this particular thing, regardless of what that particular country wants to do.
Thank you very much. Do you like to?
Yeah, I think a lot of very interesting points have been made. I just want to add one relating to aid effectiveness. At the moment, I think we're in quite potentially a sort of interesting and possibly watershed moment for ODA. I think that there's two things I see going on. One is on this aid effectiveness debate, and within national governments that are undergoing their own processes of fiscal restraint, budget cuts, etc., in, for example, in Western Europe and the countries that I'm from, where the debate, because of the issue of cutting back domestically, has focused increasingly on the effectiveness in this very narrow terminology of, you know, what's the return to each dollar, which makes it a very short-term agenda, largely driven by priorities in domestic politics. And rather than trying to convince voters that there is a broader solidarity agenda around development assistance, what we're seeing instead is much more the excuse, if you like, of governments that voters want to see, you know, bang for the buck. And I think this is something we really have to sort of fight against in the development community. And it does link to the problem of domestic accountability versus accountability to the nations that we're supposedly trying to help. That's one issue. The other critical issue that's happening right now is the emerging donors. Now, Korea's come in, but it's come into the DAC, so it's trying to conform to the norms of the DAC process. We can question whether they're the appropriate ones, etc., but it's part of a global norm. You have a much bigger factor of China, India, Brazil coming in as donors, and donors where aid is very much more integrated, particularly in the Chinese case, also the Indian case, with trade, investment, other development processes. And so I think this is going to shift in whichever direction. I think it's still an open question of what this is going to mean for development assistance, particularly for lower income countries. But I think it really does and will change the nature of the debate. It'll change the position of DAC within this debate. And it makes you know, institutions like G20, I think, potentially very important for resolving some of these issues.
Can you be very brief?
Yeah, sure. Answering the question from the audience, how to maintain the relationship between public awareness of ODA and national interest. I think it depends on how you structure the message. I mean, at the beginning of official development assistance in Korea, the Korean government emphasized that we are returning because we received. But I think we passed that stage now. And then maybe at that moment, many Koreans felt, you know, proud of themselves and the tears welling up, something like that. But I think now is the time to think and to link national interest with official development assistance. But the concept of national interest to be linked with the official development assistance is not narrow one like immediate economic, you know, benefit from, you know, benefit from giving aid, but it is more long-term indirect benefit from, you know, from giving, you know, official development assistance, like, you know, more peaceful environment, a peaceful world. Then, you know, Koreans can do more, to go abroad more, and then freely, and then do what they want to do at the global stages. So I think it is the how you structure the message of official development and national interest. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this public awareness and accountability in ODA is very important because the taxpayer pay here, but the money spent somewhere else. So we need to explain how the money is spent, what kind of object we achieved. I think that point is very important. Well, I think that we need to move to the third questions. The third question is there such a thing Korean model for development? I think the Korean people are very proud of our achievement, and also we are very keen to share our development experience with other developing countries. But before push that idea further, I think we need to think whether the Korean model is useful for other countries with different backgrounds. So that is the idea of these questions. Maybe I ask this question first to Dr. Asep Suryahadi.
Thank you, Professor Kwon. Although I think the term Korean model of development itself is still controversial, I think there are several characteristics or elements of Korean development which has been agreed by, in general, by many people. And I would like to focus on two features of Korean development. One is state leadership in the market. Many people say it as state intervention in the market, but I prefer to say it as state leadership in the market. This is a prominent feature, I think, for a long time in the Korean development. But when we think about applying this model into other countries, we certainly should think about the local context. Because, for example, when a country has a state which is predatory, then asking them to intervene or to lead the market, then for certain we will get disaster. The second feature of the Korean development, which I think has been agreed by many people, is strong partnership between public and private sectors. Again, we should look this into specific local context when we talk about this in other countries. Because if the state and the private sector collude for their own interests, it will become a negative effect for the economy. So again, here I think the message is that there is a need for both the government side and the private sector side to develop their synergy for the good of the economy as a whole, not for just their own groups. So again, I would like to emphasize that you should not supplant the Korean model of development as it is to other countries. Rather, you should look into the local context and what are the element that you can tell them that is important from this model. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Kim, do you think there is a Korean model for development?
This is a very famous debate among political scientists, sociologists, and economists. And the big debate is it the state or the market? But I'm a sociologist, and I think everything is the right answer. So, so I'll try to share with you what I think are the distinct features or attributes of Korean development that are relevant in this context. First of all, Korea's rapid industrialization based on export-oriented growth is very important. As I said earlier, Korea's GNP per capita was only $81 in 1961. That's one of the extreme poor countries. We're now above $20,000 in GNP per capita. We're 13th or 14th largest economy in the world. So that rapid economic development is a very important element. The second issue is Korea's rapid economic development was attained with democratization, but democratization did not come automatically. It was a very difficult process, but nonetheless, we attained both development and democratization. And the third issue, why Korean development experience is so relevant and important for other low-income countries, is because we attained this in the context of security tensions. We had a very hard history with North Korea, with the Korean War, and the tension between the two Koreas continues to this day. So we were able to achieve development and democracy in the context of very fragile security context. And for these three reasons, fast development, development democracy, and development in the context of security tensions, make the Korean case very relevant to other countries. On the other hand, when I think of not just the Korean development model, but to think about the Korean ODA model, then I hesitate. Because Korea's development was attained, as I said, democratization didn't come naturally. It came with a lot of suffering and oppression, and with a very difficult period of social unrest that led to democratization and so on. So there were a lot of costs involved.
Okay, thank you very much.
Wishy-washy answer.
Okay. I'd like to invite Manuel Riesco to intervene to these questions.
Thank you, Professor Kwon. I don't know if there is a Korean model, but I can tell you what are the aspects of your development that for a Chilean are the ones who amaze us the most. First of all, development is all about peasants becoming urban workers and creating markets. Because in the peasant society, you cannot have a market. As you know, peasants work for themselves, mostly. Now, in that process, the state has always played the central role. But it has two phases, really. The first phase, the state has to do everything, because nobody else can do it. So the state has to build roads, industries, etc. It's the only one who can. But then there is a point when the state already, through social policies, created the basis for a market that is a modern urban workforce. That is the base, the real basis for the market, the modern market. At that moment, the state has to shift and adopt a second strategy that here has been defined as orienting market development. Well, in the 20th century, all countries that developed in the 20th century had these two phases, all of them. However, in the shift, some countries were able to make that turn effortlessly or seamlessly or without a breakthrough. Other countries, like mine, in the process of making that shift, destroyed much of what they had built before. So the first thing that I envy you is the way that you made that shift effortlessly. And the second part, you will laugh. I envy you that you do not have many natural resources.
Yes, that's true.
Really. Because you understood clearly that the only real source of the modern riches of countries is people, yes, and well-educated people. Take the case of Chile. After 50 years of developmentalism, then we became mad and we decided that we should give away our resources. And so, as we have a lot of resources, we have had 40 years where half of the investment of the 40 years has gone to one sector, mining, that employs less than 1% of the workforce. Imagine. So our development is based on resources, not on people. We have had 8% average unemployment during 40 years, and we have destroyed and dismantled our educational system because people don't matter as much there as here. So that is the second point I would say we must learn.
Okay, Manuel, but I'd like to congratulate you on the successful rescue operation of Chilean miners. Well, I like to change the question a little bit. So my question to Thandika is that, is Korean model relevant for African countries?
Well, first of all, Gandhi was once asked what he thought about Western civilization, and he said it would be an interesting idea. And I have the same view about the Korean model. You know, I think there's a model. I don't think it's a Korean model.
No.
I think there is a process of catching up, which almost every latecomer has followed. And I would actually argue that that model probably comes from the US. When the US was catching up with Alexander Hamilton as the first Minister of Financial Affairs, he had exactly the same policies that were pursued later on first by Germany, and then by Japan, by Korea. And I think those models have got one common thing. One is that you learn. It's very important to learn from others. Two, that you leapfrog, you jump certain stages. You don't do everything that the other one, that means you don't repeat the Japanese models. You jump over the Japanese model. So equally, for Africa, we should not repeat the Korean model.
Okay.
We should jump over the Korean model.
Well, very good. So I'm looking forward to African model, jumping over Korean model.
There's a very good article, actually, it's an interesting article. A book, actually, is about, instead of talking about the tigers, it's talking about the rolling lions of Africa.
Okay, lions. So before we go through again to panelists, I'd like to invite questions from the floor. Anyone who, okay. Can you identify?
Thank you. My name is Ewha, master's students at GSPA Seoul National University. What I thought was there might be different perspectives toward Korean model for development, depending on looking back or looking further. Many people will focus on, as you mentioned, Korea's own way to achieve its economic development from 1960s. However, at this time being, to build effective Korean aid model within donors community to give the recipient countries the Korean alternative. It can refer to strategically competitive fields of Korea compared to other donor countries. For example, pretty well-developed ICT technology or health or administrative systems. I doubt even Korean people would not easily come up with the same images or contents of what the Korean model for development includes. So thus my question here is, how could the Korean model for development be defined to draw up the consensus? Thank you.
Okay. Maybe some more questions? Okay.
I'm Seoul Yoon from the Graduate School of International Study of Seoul National University. Before I ask my questions, I really like to thank all the panels. I'm really enjoying the session. Here comes my first question. I'm talking about the Korean model for development, not the ODA model. It seems to me that the Korean development model that the panels are talking about are mainly referring to the rapid economic development Korea had from the 1960s to 80s. So can a 30-year-ago model be applied to year 2010? Now the world is so much more integrated and intertwined, and unlike in the 1970s where the nation state was the main actor, we have transnational actors as well affecting nation's development policy. And second is, I'm really flattered that you said Korea is one of the countries that you envy the most and very amazed at. I'm really flattered to even sit in this conference and talking about that. But I was wondering if some developing countries can say that they're adopting the Korean model to justify their strong government-led or authoritarian regime.
Okay. Sarah, would you like to respond?
Okay. Yeah, I think, can we ever have a consensus on these issues? I think maybe we just need to work out why we're trying to understand the Koreans' development process and for what purposes. And I think here we're trying to understand whether we can draw some applicable lessons for economic and social, more equitable development, which is what we see happening in Korea for other countries, for lower income countries. And I think from that point of view, we do need to go beyond the 60s to 80s period. That's one part of it, but I think we've just mentioned how Korea responded to the financial crisis and how it expanded its welfare system, how it continued to ensure more equitable growth after that process, I think is also a very important lesson. And I think it is, it relates to the issues we've been talking about the flexibility to respond to conditions and to adapt policies to particular contexts. And I think in this respect, I do agree with the people who are noting the global context. Korea, a lot of, its main period of development, we can call it a late industrializer, leapfrogging and pursuing a model of the East Asian economies, and focusing very heavily on industrialization in a context where there was a lot more national policy space to do that. The countries that followed, and even I would include China, some of the other Asian economies, were what we might call late liberalizers. They had to liberalize, they had to try and develop in a context where the global policy space for national industrial policies, more protection, infant industry policies, etc., was much more limited. And so I think those are the kind of questions. Can we understand what was necessary about Korea's domestic policy and the kind of policies it pursued within that context? And what does that mean now? Does it really challenge the global policy agenda? What kind of more protective policies are needed for lower income countries, maybe to support their agriculture during certain phases of development, to protect their capital markets against sort of rapid financialization. So I think there are issues that put it in a global context that Korea was able to experience and develop because it had state capacity and to be effective in those conditions, but it was in a different context, and I think we have to remember both those elements.
Any other further comments? Okay.
My name is Moon-kyung, and I'm an undergraduate student from Seoul National University. And my question is, what are the main characteristics of Korean model for development? You already have mentioned many aspects, but I want to stress again that what would be the unique factor that represent not just development model, but the Korean development model? I personally think that Korean people's emphasis on education, the strong passion for education can be one factor. But some people cite a strong central political leadership that former President Park Chung-hee played in the 1960s as a main driving force behind the nation's so-called miracle of Han River. However, such a leadership could have been successful only in the basis of that the geopolitical situation at that moment, such as after Korean War and Cold War period and divided countries. So what I'm thinking of is that those geopolitical situations as well as political leadership can be and are very complicated factors. So can such change of factors be said as a modal element? So if it is difficult to modelize, it would be impossible to apply that factors to other countries.
Okay.
Yeah, that's my answer.
But one more questions before we go back to panelists.
Thank you. My name is Kang. I'm a graduate school student at GSIS SNU. Well, as you already mentioned, international community has reached to some Beijing norms on international assistance, which were summarized into 5 principles of Paris Declaration on aid effectiveness, as you all know, which were the ownership, alignment, harmonization, managing for result, and mutual accountability. Here is my questions: that isn't the Korean model, which is emphasized in Korea, have somewhat negative connotation that Korean style is the only and the best way to development? And isn't the Korean model against the first and not least principle of Paris Declaration, which is ownership? And it's for me, the idea of Korean style development sounds pretty much like Korea-led development. But the international community put great emphasis on development led by recipient countries. Can Korean model development and the principle of ownership compatible?
The one question I think from the floor is that international environment, where For example, we need to compare the 1960s and 70s when the Korea make a big progress, and maybe 1980s is different decade for development. Can you compare how these two periods is different?
Well, in looking back historically, every country that develops often has to contend against constraints. I mean, Korea, there was a war here. This country was, so it's, there are some bad policymakers who think that since there was a war in Korea, we should have some little war in Africa too. So I don't expect that the model, that the next model will have to have the same conditions. The current environment is, I don't think at any time when an environment is quotation mark favorable. I mean, you have to seize the opportunity. There were many countries who were here who were with you in 1960 that didn't do well, okay, under the same environment. So it's complicated. And I think that only 20, 25 years ago, it was said that the Taiwan-Korea model was no longer replicable because the market was saturated. And then came China, did exactly the same, even 10 times more. Okay? And now they say, well, now China's market is again, we're told, for Africa. Now it's too late, the market is saturated. If we do the same thing as China, of course, it won't work. I mean, but the point I'm saying, I think we should be very careful about favorable and unfavorable environments. We must also learn that the countries that do well, like Korea, one of the things you must learn that's going to happen to you is that now you will become part of the bad guys. Okay? You will be joining DAC and the OECD, and you will be part of the regime that makes it difficult for other people. Okay. Just give an example. Only 10 years ago, Korea didn't care very much about patent laws. Okay? And now it's very strong on enforcing patent laws because it's as a
patent law.
Yeah, as a, you're pulling up the ladder. To quote one Korean scholar here, because you've now made it. Once you made it, whether you like it or not, you'll create difficulties for the people coming behind. Each epoch has its challenges and its opportunities. So I don't see. I think, look, nobody created conditions for China's export. The Americans didn't say this. Let's help China. It didn't happen that way. So for countries like Africa and Latin America, we will have to find opportunities, our own opportunities. I think, for instance, you mentioned the question of the natural resources. We haven't yet in Africa seriously thought the implications of that as an advantage. We are sitting on huge amounts of resources. Yeah. And people tell us, you must become labor-intensive, export-oriented. You say, why should we become labor-intensive, export-oriented? Why not resource-intensive, export-oriented? Why not process our resources? So there are a lot of, I am in international conferences, I have sometimes what they call optimism of the spirit, but fundamentally pessimistic in the mind. That is, I think that we shouldn't, Africa should not expect too much favorable conditions provided for us out there. We should create them.
Okay. Professor Kim, the last question from the floor was about the putting the Korean model itself contradict the ownership of the recipient country. How do you respond to that?
That is precisely the reason why I wanted to call it a Korean alternative, not Korean model of development, which, although it doesn't really say it, it implies that it's a one-size-fits-all model, that we know it all, and we think that you must follow exactly what we did. So that's why I think it's important to spell out very clearly the strengths of our model or strengths of our experience and what we learned, as well as the mistakes that we made, so that people are aware in these other countries what we have gone through, but as an alternative, but not as a model that we say this is something that you all need to follow. And in that, maybe I can go back to the global political economic context that are very different. These are exactly the issues that I've been grappling with in the last couple of years and trying to understand how we may translate the Korean development experience into an alternative for other countries. First of all, in the global political context, in the 1960s, when Korea was trying to develop, we were in a Cold War period, which meant that there was a rivalry between the United States and USSR, led to regimes that are trying to use ODA or any kind of military economic assistance to get Korea favors from other developing countries. So there wasn't a context where these superpowers were willing to provide resources to you if you were seen as a member within their camp. So Korea received a lot of protection, a lot of military and economic aid from the United States within the geopolitical context of South Korea. That's very different. Nowadays, where the Cold War has ended, so there's no longer this very dichotomized rivalry of the Cold War. So the kind of assistance that were provided to these countries have dried up and are used for different issues. Trade protectionism is no longer very easy to maintain because of the WTO. So because of all these different differences in the global political and economic context from the 60s to the 2010, it's really difficult to sanitize the Korean model and say, hey, this is going to work in 2010. So I think that's why we need to show it as an alternative, show our experiences, but also very important to show what our mistakes were and some of our costs. So at the end, I would still recommend that the Korean experience can be useful even within the Paris Declaration if we say what we learned from the Korean case is Korean countries' ownership in the process of development. So if we go to any country, say, we're going to honor your ownership of your country. We're going to help you build your capacity so that you can practice your ownership. I think that's the right approach. And in that sense, I think it's going to be very compatible with the Paris Declaration.
Thank you very much. If there is no burning comments from the panel, then I think we should move to our last topic. Before I ask a panelist to respond to these questions, I just remind you that this conference is co-organized by United Nations Research Institute for Social Development and the Graduate School of Public Administration, Seoul National University. And without these two institutions working together, this wonderful debate cannot be possible. So, having said that, I will go to our last questions. The last question is that, is G20 a viable global framework? So who is going to answer that question first?
Me.
Of course, Dr. Kang.
I think the answer runs in two directions. Yes, the G20 can be a viable global framework because it has a broader representation of developing countries and thus more legitimacy than G7. But G20 may not be viable because it is not a treaty-bound organization, and then it has a very limited mandate of crisis management. As you all know, the sense of crisis has weakened. And like the US-China foreign exchange rate issue shows, even conflicts are emerging within the G20. If the major countries within the G20 fail to get along, the future of G20 is very uncertain. And then, depending on the result of the Seoul summit, we will get a better idea of the future of G20. And then, hopefully, I mean, the meeting of finance ministers is being held in Gyeongju today. And then if they can come up with a certain framework, not exact solution to the currency problems between China and the United States, but just framework for solving currency issues and other global economy issues, then we may see more brighter future for the G20. But let's just keep our fingers crossed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. How about UN's point of view? How do you see G20? Do you feel competition or complementarity?
Well, I don't think I can speak for the UN, but I think it's very clear that there needs to be some kind of improved global governance framework. I think that we can agree on. I think what the G20 seems to have done is provide something that at least moves towards an alternative that is more representative than the G8, but is not burdened with the problems of having a G192 of the UN. So we need some mechanisms at an intermediate level. And so then I think the G20 provides us with the space for thinking about, how can that operate in practice? It's open up to debates now about the legitimacy, about the mandate, about how it can be more representative. So I think the issue now is to think about the question of can it be, rather than is it or is it not, and see how, are the ways to make this or some broader-based, intermediate, broadly representative institution more responsive for a global development framework. And I think in that sense, it has to move from being a financial crisis response organization to really, as the Seoul Summit is trying to do, putting development issues on the agenda and being more broadly representative of developing as well as developed countries.
Thank you very much. Asep, I think Indonesia is also a member of G20. Yeah? Yes. How do you see this G20 summit?
When we first invited to the first G20 meeting, Indonesians were very excited, because it is an acknowledgement of the sheer largeness of the Indonesian economy and population. But over time, that enthusiasm has been waning, because it turned out that not much real impact that can be felt by the people from this G20. And I think it also happened not only in Indonesia, perhaps other countries also which are not too prominent within the G20 feel the same. So I think to maintain the viability of G20, it is important that this forum of countries is not dominated by one or two countries or a group of countries, and it should be as inclusive as possible in discussing issues. And also I think membership in G20 should be not static. It was determined in 2008 based on the 20 largest economies in the world, and that should be followed. I mean, that should be reviewed regularly, meaning that countries that has fallen from the rank should not be in the G20 anymore, and the countries that has rise to the rank should be included in the G20.
Okay, thank you. I think one of the strengths of the G20 meeting is institutionally very light. It has no big bureaucracy, so it can move, it can be flexible. But at the same time, who vote for the G20? What is the democratic mandate of the G20 to decide the people's livelihood? Manuel, do you like to respond to that question?
Thank you. Well, I think that the G20 is a response to one of the greatest shifts that is taking place in the world, and it's the shift of the balance of economic power, for now, between what was the developing world and the developed world. And of course, this was accelerated because of the recent and current crisis that was initiated in the developed countries. So this accelerated this shift and forced to make the G8 G20. I think it's good that we have 20 and not 8. But the effectiveness will be tested quite soon, and in quite pressing problems. Because this problem of currency war, for example, is really a quite pressing problem. It's not an easy matter. In our country, for example, a very small country, a very open country, and computers every night make billions of dollars come in or out of the country according to algorithms that they have. And the effect that that has over employment, business, etc., is huge. So really, we have a big problem there.
Okay. Before I go further to panelists, I'd like to invite Dr. Peter Wolf from German Development Institute. I think the German Development Institute had some research on this issue. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think it has been said already that the G20 obviously is in a critical phase. It has been certainly effective in containing the worst of the financial crisis. I mean, we were fearing that something would happen like in the Great Depression of the last century. And through the multilateral process, through collective action in the G20, this could be avoided. So nobody was really asking too many questions about the legitimacy of the G20 as long as it was effective in that sense. But as we have heard and as we all can read in the newspapers now, the effectiveness in terms of reforming the world economic system, the global currency system is put into question. And that's why the legitimacy issue is debated now. And I think it was mentioned already that the next two summits, Korea and France, will decide on the future of the G20. And I think we will have a debate on the membership of the G20. I think there will be something like rotating membership on a regional basis. There has to be a better regional representation of regions in the G20, and it cannot be the host, this time Korea, next time France, to decide on who is invited to sit around the table. So there will be more formal mechanisms, and there has to be a stronger link to the UN system, which has been kind of avoided by the G20 within this period of crisis management, because it was thought the UN is not needed in crisis management. But definitely, I think the UN system is needed when it comes to long-term global issues.
Well, I'd like to invite the comments and questions from the floor. Anyone who asks the questions on this issue? Okay.
I'm Huck-ju Kwon, doctoral student of Graduate School of Public Administration. First of all, the panel mentioned about the legitimacy issues, but I look up some research results. According to the Brookings research of 2007, they studied the result of past G20 financial summit from 1998 to 2006. And according to that research, G20 has served as just as vehicle for G7 countries. They just endorsed the G7-driven policy. So I think if they open their door to developing countries, not on the surface, but in reality, I think G20 cannot be the global governance having legitimacy. And my second point is, yesterday in a keynote speech, Professor Thandika emphasized that we should bring back the development agenda again into the today's context, into the global G20 meetings. But as all of us know, the most hotly disputed issues of G20, this whole summit, is the currency global war between the China and the United States. And but Korean government is very, very proud of to make the development agenda as the main agenda of this whole summit. But I think they just want to decorate the table of the summit. So, so actually and frankly, the global the G20 financial ministry is a child of financial crisis, Asian financial crisis of 1997, and this premier summit is the child of global financial crisis of 2008. What I want to say is that this is just for global financial architecture, not for the social policy architecture. So Professor Thandika, how do you think of this opinion? Is it really possible to address sincerely social policies in a global G20 meetings?
Okay, Thandika, can you wait a minute so we can have more questions? Any other further comments? Okay.
My name is Ryu Jae-eung. I'm from GSPA SNU. Yeah, like everybody says, sometimes G20 is being criticized for its representativeness and even called China America, which means China plus America. Everybody knows what that means. And these two countries seem to focus very much on, like the panel said, foreign currency exchange rate. Then my question is, how do we draw up a legitimate decision-making process to guarantee other countries' participation within the framework of G20?
Okay. Any other question? Okay, just next to you.
Thank you. My name is Jo Eun-seok, PhD student at GSPA from Seoul National University. I'd like to relate some questions back to the basic concept. As you know, the IMF and World Bank and UN has managed social and economic global issues, the so-called Bretton Woods systems, and at the same time, the world has become more fragmented and regionalized powers. So in this context, what is the main goal and their identity to comparing to other international organizations? Because if without G20's own goal setting or the role establishment, it could make more another policy complexity or the fatigue to global society. In another question, especially to dealing with social development issue, I'd like to think to encourage the civil society and business sectors to participate in this kind of issue, to implement social development policies successfully. So how could the G20 embrace these other sectors, the participation and their perspective? Because the G20's perspective only focused on some state-oriented provisions, so it has a lot of the limitation to implement very crucial policy. Thank you.
Okay. Thandika, it's your turn.
Well, honestly, I don't have an answer. Look, the first thing about the G20, remember in the UN, in the international system, there have been at least 3 principles of representation. One, which was the UN one country, one vote. Then there's been the World Bank $1, one vote. Okay. And now people have talked about, I think this morning someone was talking about that there was one man, one citizen, one vote. And so we don't really have a system, we haven't really agreed on what are the dominant principles. And historically, when the first sort of Bretton Woods institution was set up, Keynes, who was one of the big brains behind it, made a very racist statement to the fact that he hoped that these new emerging rabble-rousers from the third world would not be part of it. Okay. So that there has always been an attempt to keep the financial part of the story away from the, from the rest of us. Okay. And so that has been a core part of the World Bank stuff. You know, you vote according to $1 one vote, and it's been repeated in IMF and so forth. The G20 is, to me, probably the only good thing about it, that it symbolizes a recognition that out there are some new powers emerging. Okay? But you have to understand that the core purpose for the concession by the West to these new powers out there is to help them solve a financial problem. There is a financial problem. And the system wants to solve that, and they have to bring in the Chinas and all that. And whether we can, you know, capture that G20 to do something else, I'm a little bit skeptical. These institutions are very difficult to, once they've been designed and given a purpose by those who are key players, they're very difficult to be given other tasks. We've seen it with the World Bank and IMF. I mean, people have been shouting at IMF to take on different tasks. It's been very extremely difficult. So I find that it's very, very difficult to do that. But I think we perhaps, as I said, just knocking at the door, maybe one shouldn't stop. I mean, keep on knocking at the door. But I wouldn't expect much to happen. However, there is a danger, I don't know what a danger or a trend, which Manuel points out to. If countries feel that they cannot make themselves heard at these meetings, they will go regional. Okay? And for better or worse, my suspicion that we will see more regionalism than if the global club is closed. And I'm surprised that a country like Singapore would complain. If Singapore complains about Western misbehavior, this must be serious. Okay. And Singapore has complained about that this is exclusive. And, you know, and usually Singapore wouldn't complain about that. And so there's something very serious about this exclusion of many other countries. And so you will probably see more of this regionalism. And so I don't place much hope on the agenda. However, you have to ideologically keep on pushing. Okay? You know, keep on pushing for the agenda that you think is a much broader agenda.
Okay, I think we have now time pressure. So if anyone to respond very quickly.
Okay. In running international organizations, there are two things to consider. One is democracy, the other one is efficiency. G20 has gained more democracy because it represents, includes 20 countries. In terms of efficiency, it includes 20 systemically important countries. So these countries have substantively more influence on international and global economic affairs. So in terms of democracy and efficiency, G20 satisfies, not perfectly, but satisfies both. So that's why G20 has a potential to be viable in a global framework. The future of G20, it depends on how emerging countries, emerging economies behave within the G20. I mean, maybe the G20 originally was formed for a financial crisis, and whether it can include address other issues like social protection and development, it depends on how emerging economies behave within the countries. So as long as there are plenty of incentives to cooperate within the G20, and it can continue. So hopefully the emerging economies like China, Brazil, Korea, and Indonesia, South Africa can forge cooperation within the G20, so G20 can continue its momentum. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think with that intervention, I think we should close our Seoul Development Debate. I think it was very useful and helpful debate. I don't try to summarize what we have discussed. I think it's too much. But I have two things. One is that social protection and economic development should go together. The question is how to do it. And it is not just a matter of the policymakers' job. I think I like to put that challenge to you, to young students and our colleagues in the academia and policy world. So we need to think about how to make it possible, how to combine these two good things together. The second message I'd like to conclude is the Korean people. We are very proud of what we have done, but not only speaking about our experience, I think we need to listen to other people, especially listen to our colleagues from the developing countries if we are be useful to their social and economic development. Okay, once again, I'd like to thank you, the panelists, for the participation, wonderful discussion. And also I'd like to thank you all the audience for their participation. Thank you very much.
G20이 세계 경제의 85%를 차지하고 세계 인구의 3분의 2를 차지한다고 해서 과연 G20의 결정이 세계를 대변하는 것일까요? 이 질문에 대한 답을 얻기 위해 이번 G20에서는 세계 속의 경제적 약자를 끌어안을 수 있는 실천 방법에 대해서까지 논의해야 한다는 건데요. 지금껏 국제사회가 논의해온 글로벌 정의 실현을 위한 인류 공영의 책임으로서의 개발을 실천할 때 G20은 진정 세계를 대변하는 경제결정기구로 거듭날 수 있을 겁니다. 오랜 시간 시청해주신 여러분 고맙습니다.